I'm Julia, and welcome back to Race to Win, the sailing podcast. Today we have some pretty exciting new tech to show you in our 3D replays. We've added wind shadow functionality to the raceQs interface, and you get it by selecting it right here in the settings menu. So let's start out with the basics. A wind shadow, or dirty air, is just the disturbed air that your boat creates as it's sailing. We show two main areas of dirty air in our interface. The large circle here is the wind shadow, also called wind wash, dirty wind, dirty air, and the small one is the lee bow zone. If you don't know what lee bowing is, we're going to be going over that in our next podcast, but today we're going to be focusing on the bigger shape, this dirty air zone. There are a couple of important advanced things to note about this feature before we go any further. First of all, it's projecting the shadow in line with the apparent wind angle, not the true wind angle. So this is important, especially when you're looking at it for downwind. Also, as the wind blows harder in real life, your wind shadow actually becomes smaller. So as your boat goes faster in the replay, the software will shrink your wind shadow size, assuming that you're going faster because there's more wind. This is a sailboat, right? So the point of all this is you want to try not to be in your competitor's wind shadow unless you're trying to lee bow them. If you are in someone's wind shadow, it's best to jibe or tack away, even if it takes two quick tacks. As long as your tacks aren't terrible, you're going to lose more being stuck in that wind shadow than if you take those clearing tacks over time. So let's take a look at a few examples of how the wind shadow comes into effect when sailing. The first and most obvious thing is covering. There you can cover someone or someone can be covering you, and there are two types of covering, loose and tight. A loose cover is when you're protecting your position by keeping your boat between your competition and something like a mark, but you aren't close enough to actually be gassing them with your wind shadow. You cover by tacking or jibing with them so that you have pretty much the same wind. The point here is to keep them from passing you by catching a puff or a favorable wind shift that you don't get. The other kind of cover is a tight cover, and that's when you're deliberately gassing someone who has no chance to escape, forcing them to tack away. And if you want to keep that close cover, you're going to tack again on top of them. But unless you're in match racing, it's generally not a good idea to get into these tacking duels unless you're very close to the finish or rounding a mark, which brings us to a point, when should you cover? So if you're just about to finish and you aren't going to catch the boats ahead of you, and the boats behind you are too far behind to catch up, you should probably cover the guy that's right behind you to make sure that he doesn't get a puff that you don't get and get you right at the line. Nobody likes that. Another idea is if it's a series of races and maybe you're getting near the end of the series and there's just one boat that you're really competing against. They're the one that's going to really affect your performance when you sit there and do the math. So you might want to cover that guy, but be aware and take into account what's going to happen if it means losing other boats in the fleet. Let's watch what India does as she gets sucked into Mike's wind shadow here. She was behind, kind of late to the start, and now is trying to pass but falling into the shadow. Now, you have some choices here, right? You can tack away or try to sail under and through. What doesn't work is trying to point higher, pretty much ever. So she is actually going to drive down here and drive right through the wind shadow. So we see now she's about 18 meters behind, and she's getting that speed from driving down, allowing her to punch through that dirty air, is coming out the other side, and is now passing Mike and is going to pull ahead. This is a great example of what to do. And she didn't hesitate. They didn't sit there wondering, oh, what should we do? Where should we go? They just steered right down, rolled right underneath, and now are clear ahead. So great example of what to do. And look at that. Now India is gassing Mike and is even just really pulling ahead and leaving him in the dust. Let's take a look at Juliet and India here right after the start. Juliet is actually ahead of India. But India is coming along and is just going to roll right over the top. Now, Juliet had the opportunity here to come up and get into the lee bow position on India, which is that green circle right there, and, you know, hold the lead. But instead, she's going to miss quite a few puffs. Now, you can tell there's a puff because, whoosh, see that? right there. See how small the wind shadow is on India here? That indicates a sudden burst of speed, which is going to be caused by a puff of wind generally. We can see that she is falling behind here. She's missing the puffs. Again, you're not seeing that rapidly shrinking area that you're seeing on Juliet as she's accelerating. She's trying to steer up a bit, maybe to escape, to get away from the pack. That never works. You can steer down to get out of the wind shadow, but steering up, now you're just basically getting deeper into it, because the wind shadow actually does extend, as you can see here if you look at Juliet, far upwind, and finally she's going to tack and get out of there after falling way behind. So here's another example using the 3D wind shadow. You can see these are two Melja's 24, and the one boat, 15, is right here behind 24. Now, he's been hanging out at sort of the edge of the wind shadow, doing okay. We can see that he's holding the speed pretty steady. He's starting to slow down a bit now, 5.3 to 5.7, 5.5. Now he's actually going faster, so he's hanging in there knowing that he's still keeping his boat speed, and what he's doing is he's just waiting for a clear lane to tack. There's a lot of other boats over here. This is a very busy race. And as soon as he is slowing down in there, he sees his lane, he takes it, and he gets out of there. And that's what you want to see. You don't want to be waiting and really suffering in a wind shadow if there's somewhere else that you can go. Also, make sure to use those loose and tight covers when they're appropriate, not just because you can, and end up losing the race to the rest of the fleet. I'll see you next time for our Lee Bow podcast. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can find more on our website, www.raceQs.com/podcast, or search for raceQs on iTunes and click subscribe.